you can kind of generally break down cardio into 4 different categories. You've got low intensity steady state. And so that's usually you're going to find that your heart rate is somewhere between 50 to 69% of max heart rate. And you can get into all sorts of discussions about the best way to determine max heart rate. I suppose they're interesting discussions if you're into it, but there's a bunch of different equations, or you could just test it, do a maximal aerobic test. But anyway, 50 to 69%, you're usually going to call that low intensity cardio. And that's usually going to be done steady state because frankly, there's not much of a need to have rest intervals when you're keeping intensity that low. Moderate intensity steady state usually is going to be around 70 to 84% of maximum heart rate. Theoretically, you could do a steady state bout at a much higher intensity, but it's going to be a relatively inefficient way to do exercise because you're going to do one go and really tire out, and that's going to be the end of your workout. So usually with moderate intensity, steady state exercise, it's going to be more of a prolonged exercise session so you can really get a decent volume of work in. Now, high intensity interval training, usually you're going to see work bouts that are at least 85% of max heart rate. And you're going to see kind of switching back and forth between work intervals, which are the high intensity intervals, and then rest intervals, which either involve low intensity exercise or just passive rest, right? So you might do a sprint on a bicycle and as your work interval, and then during the rest period, just kind of pedal very lightly and just kind of recover, or you might take your feet off the pedals altogether. It's kind of up to your preference. A cautionary note, it can be very jarring to do super high intense sprints with passive rest periods that are short. Sometimes it's very nice to have some active recovery to kind of get some of those metabolites circulating. So sometimes people assume that the passive rest rather than the low activity rest is going to be easier. Sometimes it can be very nauseating if you're doing really intense intervals.
Yeah.
Now that brings me to the final one, which is sprint interval training. And this is the kind of subtype of high intensity interval training that a lot of people think is the only type of high intensity interval training. This is where you are doing maximal intensity work intervals. So the work interval will be a sprint at the highest attainable intensity, and then you're going to have low intensity periods as well with active or passive recovery. So sprint interval training is a lot like back in the day when bodybuilders like 2012, 2013 got really into modified wind gates as a cardio modality. And what they would do is like a 15 or a 30-second sprint on the bike, and then, a minute or 90 seconds or 2 minutes of rest, and just kind of repeat through these extremely high intensity, maximal intensity sprints on the bike. So that is sprint interval training, which could be viewed as a subtype of high intensity interval training. But what's really interesting is a lot of the common HIIT protocols in the literature, they actually involve 4-minute work bouts, which a lot of people I think would assume doesn't even meet the criteria for high intensity interval training. And it doesn't just meet the criteria. It's one of the most common protocols you see in the literature. So a really common protocol is 4 minutes of work, aiming to get above 85% of max heart rate, and then 4 minutes of, either active or passive rest. Usually it's going to be active rest when you have a 4 minute, it's usually 3 or 4 minutes for the rest interval. So usually people will do 4 rounds of that. So it'll be 4 4-minute work intervals. And then between those, you have 3 or 4 minutes of active rest. But there are also a variety of different protocols that involve 1-minute work intervals, 2-minute, 3-minute, 4-minute, and some as short as, 30 seconds. And you'll see sprint interval training where you see really, really rapid sprints. We're talking 6, 10, 15 seconds long of just super high intensity effort. So the span of what you could generally call either sprint interval training or high intensity interval training, we're talking about sprints from 6 seconds long up to work intervals that are 4 minutes long. And usually, generally speaking, if I'm doing a HIIT or a sit workout, I try to make the total duration of the session somewhere between 15 and 25 minutes. If you're doing that and you've got a sensible work to rest ratio, between your two intervals, that's probably going to put you in a spot where you're able to get enough, total work in, enough total volume to feel like you got a nice session, but you don't want to go overboard with high intensity interval training. So for me personally, if I'm doing high intensity interval training, I try to do 15 to 25 total minutes, and I try to keep my work to rest ratio somewhere around 1-to-1. So my favorite protocol by far is 1 minute of very high intensity, 1 minute of active rest, and I'll do 10 rounds of that. So it ends up being about 19, 20 minutes. That's kind of right in the sweet spot, 1-to-1 ratio, work to rest. If I'm doing sprint interval training, again, I try to keep it to 15 to 25 minutes, but usually because it is maximal intensity, you see that the work to rest ratio actually goes down. So instead of being 1 part work and 1 part rest, usually it's 1-to-3 or even 1-to-8 when you start to see really short sprints. But yeah, so somewhere in that ballpark of 1-to-3 to 1-to-8 for your work to rest ratio. Of course, all of those sprints, whether it's going to be 6 seconds or 15 or 30 seconds, usually that's kind of the range. You don't see a lot of sprint interval training with durations that are too high above 30 seconds, maybe a minute, but that's pretty much where it kind of caps. But yeah, so you want to make sure that you're getting a proper work to rest ratio, keeping your total duration. I would start out in the 15 to 25 minute range. And there are a lot of different ways to incorporate, high intensity interval training, even if you don't like the super intense sprint type workouts.